To order, and I want to welcome everybody to meeting number 69 of the Standing Committee on Health, and we're here to discuss, examine an act respecting cannabis and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. And I want to welcome all of our guests, and they will be, we will hear from them in the order, this order. The Honorable Jody Wilson-Raybould, Minister of Justice, will make a presentation first. Then the Honorable Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor will make a presentation as Minister of Health, and then when Mr. Goodell comes, the Honorable Ralph Goodell will make a presentation as Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. From the Department of Health, we have back, by popular demand, Jacqueline Bogdan, Assistant Deputy Minister, Cannabis Legislation and Regulation Branch. And from the Department of Justice, again, we have Carol Morense, Director General and Senior General Counsel, Criminal Law and Policy Section. And from the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, again, we have Trevor Pupsing. Welcome back, Director General, Law Enforcement and Border Strategies Directorate. Now, I understand Mr. Goodell will be a little late, and so we're going to start in his absence, and perhaps, yes.
Mr. Chair, may I just clarify, will the ministers be here for the entire 2 hours of the meeting?
Will the ministers be here for the entire 2 hours?
Thank you.
Yes, that was a question I was asking. I wasn't saying. I was looking for a nod. But will the ministers, one? Okay, good. Okay, yes.
Thank you.
And Mr. Goodell will be a little bit late. But now, if we could ask the Honorable Jody Wilson-Raybould to start off with 10 minutes on cannabis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee. It is indeed a pleasure to be here, and I recognize that you came back early to have discussions and hear from witnesses on this most important topic that my honourable colleagues, Minister Goodell and Petitpas-Taylor, are pleased to present on C45, the Cannabis Act. While the committee was doing its important work in terms of looking at this bill, Minister Goodell and I were meeting with our provincial and territorial counterparts in Vancouver. Cannabis and drug-impaired driving were both significant parts of our agenda. And we both feel that engagement with the provinces and territories is an incredibly important feature in our work to date. There can be no doubt that the legalization and strict regulation of cannabis has sparked much discussion, both before and particularly after the introduction of Bill C45. In my remarks today, before I turn it over to my ministerial colleagues, I want to provide some background on the development of our legislative proposal, highlight the purpose of Bill C45, and provide an overview of key justice aspects. There is a broad consensus among Canadians that our current approach to cannabis is not working. Our system of criminal prohibition fosters an environment where organized crime reaps billions of dollars in profits from its sale. Thousands of Canadians end up with criminal records for non-violent cannabis offenses each year, and cannabis is not being kept out of the hands of young people. Most Canadians no longer believe that simple possession for small amounts of cannabis should be subject to harsh criminal sanctions, which can have lifelong impacts for individuals and which takes up precious resources in our criminal justice system. Our government agrees that there is a better approach, one that is evidence-based and that will protect the health and safety of Canadians with a particular focus on protecting our young people. So as a starting point, we appointed a task force on cannabis legalization and regulation on June 30th of 2016, with a mandate to advise us on the design of a new regulatory system. I know that the chairperson, the Honourable Anne McClellan, and the task force's vice chair, Dr. Mark Ware, appeared before you as witnesses last week. Hello, Minister Goodell.
Hello.
As you heard, the task force conducted extensive consultations across the country, visited the states of Washington and Colorado, which have legalized cannabis for non-medical purposes, and considered nearly 30,000 online submissions sent in by Canadians. It also sought the views of diverse community of experts, professionals, advocates, frontline workers, youth professionals, Indigenous communities and organizations, territorial, provincial, and municipal officials, law enforcement, and citizens and employers. On December 13th of 2016, the task force delivered its final report, containing over 80 recommendations for the development of a Canadian legal cannabis framework. It reflects a public health approach aimed at reducing harm and promoting the health and safety of Canadians. The report has been very well received, is comprehensive, and provides important background information on the issues this bill seeks to address. It proved essential in developing Bill C45. The bill paves the way for Canada to become the first G20 country to legalize and strictly regulate cannabis at the national level. It was introduced last spring alongside another important piece of legislation, Bill C46, which proposes new and stronger laws to more seriously tackle drug and alcohol-impaired driving. As set out in Clause 7 of the bill, C45, our government's intention is to protect public health and safety with a particular emphasis on protecting young people's health by restricting their access to cannabis, preventing advertising and other promotional activities that are likely to encourage cannabis use, providing for lawful production of cannabis to reduce illegal activities, deterring illegal cannabis-related activities through appropriate sanctions and enforcement measures, reducing the cannabis-related burden on the criminal justice system, providing Canadians with access to quality-controlled supply of cannabis, and enhancing public awareness of health risks associated with cannabis use. Bill C45 creates a framework in which adults can access legal cannabis in an appropriate retail context that is sourced from a well-regulated industry or grown in limited amounts at home. Adults, 18 years or older, will be permitted to legally possess or share with other adults up to 30 grams of legal dried cannabis or its equivalent in other forms. Selling or possessing to do so will only be lawful if authorized under the Act. Under no circumstances will cannabis be sold or given to a young person. Production of cannabis will also require specific authorization. Possession, production, distribution, import, export, and sale outside this framework will all remain illegal and be subject to criminal penalties. These penalties will be proportionate to the seriousness of the offense, ranging from ticketing up to a maximum penalty of 14 years imprisonment. This graduated approach reflects the our legislative objectives. Bill C45 will also exempt young persons from criminal prosecution who possess or share up to 5 grams of cannabis, rather than exposing them to the criminal justice system for what amounts to very small amounts of cannabis. Above 5 grams, young people will be subject to the Youth Criminal Justice Act, which emphasizes community-based responses, rehabilitation, and reintegration. For less serious offenses, alternatives to charging are encouraged, such as taking no further action, warning the young person, or referring them to a community program or agency to help address the circumstances underlying their behavior. Under Bill C45, the federal, provincial, and territorial governments will all share in the responsibility for overseeing the new system. The federal government will oversee the production and manufacturing components of the cannabis framework and will set industry-wide rules and standards. Provinces and territories will be responsible for the distribution and sale. They will also be able to create further restrictions as they see fit, including increasing the minimum age to align with their legal drinking age. Further, the provinces and territories, along with municipalities, could create additional rules for growing cannabis at home, such as lowering the number of plants allowed per residence and restricting where cannabis can be consumed, such as in public places and vehicles. In addition to working with them to establish a secure supply chain, provinces and territories will be key partners in our government's efforts to raise public awareness about the risks associated with cannabis use. And as set out in Budget 2017, our government has provided $9.6 million for public education and awareness, as well as monitoring and surveillance activities. This includes monitoring patterns and perceptions around cannabis use amongst Canadians, especially youth, through the annual Canadian Cannabis Survey. This work will inform and refine further public education and awareness activities to mitigate the risks and the harms of use. I would now like to address some of the concerns that have been raised either during second reading debate or by witnesses appearing before you last week. I want to assure this committee that in developing the bill, we were aware of concerns voiced about the minimum age set, youth possession of small amounts of cannabis, personal cultivation, and the impact of our proposed legislation on youth. So let me start by saying that overall, Bill C45 is informed by and closely aligns with the recommendations of the task force report recommendations. In terms of minimum age, our government has accepted the task force's advice that we need to strike a balance between the known risks of cannabis and the reality that Canadian youth and young adults currently use cannabis at some of the highest rates in the world. In striking this balance, Bill C45 restricts the sale of cannabis to adults aged 18 and older. Provinces and territories will be able to set a higher minimum age, just like they do with alcohol and tobacco. In terms of exempting young persons from criminal prosecution who possess or share up to 5 grams of cannabis, we are aware of the criticism that this sends the wrong message to youth. Our government's position is clear. Young persons should not have access to any amount of cannabis. Under Bill C45, there will be no legal means for a young person to purchase or acquire cannabis. Criticizing our government's decision not to criminalize youth for possessing or sharing very small amounts of cannabis ignores the evidence. Statistics clearly show high usage rates among youth, despite the fact that cannabis is currently a prohibited substance. Our government recognizes that for very small amounts, there is a better way to deal with young people than using the full force of the criminal law. Our government has been engaging with provinces and territories to encourage them to create administrative offenses to prohibit youth from possessing any amount of cannabis, similar to what is currently done with alcohol and tobacco. This measured approach would provide police with the authority to seize cannabis from youth with small amounts. Ontario has recently announced its intention to do just that, and I have been encouraging and urging other provinces and territories to follow suit. Most recently, just last week, at the FPT meeting in Vancouver. Another issue that was raised during second reading debate was the suggestion that home cultivation could mean greater access to cannabis for children. In response, I would note that the task force concluded that small amounts of cannabis for personal use can be safely and responsibly cultivated by adults in a manner that protects young persons in the home. Adults will be required to take appropriate precautions, as they must do now when storing prescription drugs, alcohol, and other potentially harmful substances. Additionally, the significant penalties proposed in Bill C45 for selling and distributing to young persons, or for using or involving a young person in the commission of a cannabis offense, sends a strong message to any adults who would allow cannabis to get into the hands of children. In response to the other concerns raised, such as those related to the timing of implementation, challenges surrounding drug-impaired driving, and Canada's obligation under international drug treaties, I would like to emphasize that these are all issues that we continue to diligently work to address. We are continuing to work collaboratively with the provinces and territories, and as mentioned, Minister Goodale and I met with our counterparts last week. Ministers of Health, Finance, and Agriculture have also met to discuss the issue. In addition, federal officials will have maintained ongoing engagement with their counterparts. I see that the red card has been flagged for me, and Mr. Chairman, I will respect my time frame, and I very much look forward to questions, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Minister Petitpas-Taylor.
Well, I know as a Minister of Justice, you'd want to follow the rules, so.
Indeed, sir.
Okay, I want to welcome the Honourable Ralph Goodale to the table. Very good. Thanks for coming. But we're going to now go to the Honourable Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor, Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'd also like to echo my colleague, Minister Wilson-Rayble's comments about thanking the committee members. I know that you guys were called in a week early last week, and you did a lot of work. So thank you so much for coming here and doing the good work that needs to be done regarding this legislation. So I'm honored to be here today with my colleagues, Minister Goodale and Minister Wilson-Raybould, to discuss Bill C45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the remarkable progress on this file under the previous Minister of Health. It is because of her hard work and her tireless work of her staff and the staff of Health Canada that I am able to speak before you today. Protecting the health and safety of Canadians is a priority for our government and the focus of this bill. Canadians use cannabis at some of the highest rates in the world, and decades of criminal prohibition have not reduced these rates. In fact, cannabis has become the most commonly used illegal substance in Canada. Today, 21% of our youth and 30% of our young adults use cannabis. Our youth have the highest prevalence of cannabis use when compared to peers in other developed countries. This clearly shows that the current approach of cannabis is not working. This is why our government is proposing a public health approach to legalizing, strictly regulating, and restricting access to cannabis. Our aim is to minimize the harms associated with cannabis use, especially for youth. Scientific evidence shows that the risk for cannabis use are higher for youth than adults, that these risks increase the younger a person starts using it and increase further the more often that they use it. The legislation before us today, better known as Bill C45, is the foundation of our government's new approach. Through this legislation, as well as early and sustained public education and awareness, we aim to delay the age at which youth are trying cannabis and inform all Canadians of the risk of using cannabis. Today, I would like to focus on three components of this approach. Number one, protecting youth. Number two, educating and public awareness. And finally, product safety and quality control. Let's start off talking about protecting youth. I would like to be very clear. In no way are we endorsing the use of cannabis or looking to make it easier for youth to access cannabis. Quite the opposite, actually. Protecting youth is at the center of our government's approach to regulating and restricting the use of cannabis. Youth are especially vulnerable to the effects of cannabis on brain development and function. Scientific evidence shows us that the younger someone is when they start using cannabis, and the more often they use it, the greater the risk to their health. As I've already mentioned, far too many young Canadians are already accessing cannabis. In many cases, it is easier for kids to buy cannabis than cigarettes or alcohol. The data supports this. In the 2015 Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey, 21% of youth reported having used cannabis during the past year. Comparatively, 10% of youth reported using cigarettes. The striking difference in these statistics illustrate the power and effectiveness of a range of measures such as regulation, advertising, and promotion controls and public education, which over time have contributed to lower usage rates. Canada has been regulating tobacco and educating the public on the risks for the past 30 years. The percentage of youth who use tobacco has dropped from 27% in 1985 to 10% in 2015. This is why we seek to build on what we've learned by regulating tobacco. We will restrict youth access to cannabis by penalizing those who sell or give it to youth and restricting its advertising and promotion. Bill C45 would prohibit anyone from selling or providing cannabis to any person under the age of 18 through provinces and territories, though provinces and territories could increase the minimum legal age of sale, purchase, and consumption. The proposed minimum age of 18 reflects the advice we received from the Expert Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation. It also balances the need to protect our children and youth from the adverse health effects of cannabis, while at the same time recognizing that setting the minimum age too high would risk preserving the illegal market, given the high rates of use among young adults between the ages of 20 and 24. Bill C45 could create new criminal penalties for giving or selling cannabis to youth and using a youth to commit a cannabis-related offense. The bill would also prohibit certain products and marketing practices, especially those that would appeal to youth. Businesses would not be allowed to produce or sell cannabis products that might appeal to youth. Those marketing cannabis would also be prohibited from using any packaging or labeling that could be attractive to youth, including depictions of persons, celebrities, characters, or even animals. False, misleading, or deceptive advertising would be prohibited, as would sponsorships, testimonials, and endorsements of or any other form of promotion or branding that could entice young people to use cannabis. Promotion of cannabis would be permitted only if it presents factual information and is communicated in a way that could not be seen by youth. Also, cannabis could not be sold through self-service displays or vending machines. We believe that these safeguards will help keep cannabis out of the hands of our children and youth. The safeguards we are putting in place will help reduce youth access to cannabis, but we also know that youth today are less likely than adults to see cannabis use as a significant health risk. As someone who has spent my entire career as a frontline worker in areas of mental health and addictions, this doesn't surprise me, and I believe strongly that it is an issue that we must address. As with other drugs, while cannabis can be used therapeutically by some people, its use can also pose health risks. We need to provide Canadians with information about cannabis so that they can talk to their children about the risks. We must also educate and support adults in making informed and responsible choices that minimize risks, including the dangers related to drug-impaired driving. To this end, Budget 2017 directed an initial investment of $9.6 million to public education and awareness campaign to inform Canadians, particularly young people, about the risks of cannabis use. This campaign has begun and will continue over the next few years. The funds will also support an initiative to monitor trends and perceptions of cannabis use among Canadians, especially youth. This information will help inform our public education activities. The final aspect of our government's approach to cannabis that I would like to highlight is the product safety and quality requirements. The Act is designed to establish a legal and quality-controlled supply of cannabis available for sale in Canada. Under the proposed legislation and its regulations, our government would establish industry-wide rules on the types of products that would be allowed for sale. We would also have rules prohibiting the use of certain ingredients like nicotine, caffeine, and alcohol in cannabis products and require manufacturers to adhere to good production practices. The dedication and hard work that has been put into designing Canada's medical cannabis system means that we already have experience with product safety and quality requirements for cannabis. Our current system, which provides access to cannabis for medical purposes, is recognized as one of the best in the world. It includes a number of safety and security features, such as frequent inspections of production facilities and clear regulations around product testing, labeling, and pesticide use. We will be using this system of licensed production as a blueprint as we establish broader cannabis production under the bill. In conclusion, it's clear that the current system is not working. The legislation that is before you today is designed to address the issue that we are already facing. Our kids currently have access to cannabis, and organized crime continues to profit from the unregulated sale in our country. We are proposing a new way for Canada to address this problem using a public health approach. We all know that this is a far-reaching issue that stretches well beyond this particular piece of legislation. This issue demands that we cooperate across jurisdictions and sectors. Following the advice of the Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation, under this legislation, all levels of government would be able to establish certain requirements with respect to cannabis, consistent with their own jurisdictional authorities and experience. The involvement of the province and territorial governments is critical to ensuring that young people do not have access to cannabis. Under this bill, the federal government would be responsible for establishing and maintaining a comprehensive and consistent national framework to regulate production, set standards for health and safety, and establish criminal prohibitions. The province and territories could license and oversee the distribution of the sale of cannabis. Together with municipalities, they could also tailor certain rules in their own jurisdictions and enforce them through a range of tools such as tickets. We have worked closely with our provincial and territorial counterparts to ensure that their valuable input was taken into account from the beginning of this important effort, and our government is committed to continuing our ongoing collaboration with the provinces and territories on this very complex issue. With its focus on protecting youth, educating the public, and ensuring product safety and quality requirements, the bill uses a public health approach to strictly regulate and restrict access to cannabis. Our government is confident that the proposed Cannabis Act will protect the health and safety of Canadians. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much. And on behalf of all of the members of the committee, I want to congratulate you on your appointment as Minister of Health. And I'm sure that we'll all be engaged with you as we go forward on a number of issues. And certainly some of the most interesting issues on the Hill are dealt with here at this committee. So again, congratulations. Now we go to the Honourable Ralph Goodale, Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to appear before you this evening. Thank you for the invitation. Glad to join my colleagues, the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Health, Parliamentary Secretary Blair, who has been front and center in dealing with this issue over the last many months, and officials from our department. We're here obviously to discuss Bill C45 and how this legislation will help keep cannabis out of the hands of Canadian children and profits out of the hands of criminals, certainly more effectively than the failed regime that has existed in this country for many, many decades. Au cours de l'élaboration de notre approche,
during the development of our cannabis approach, the strengthening of public safety has always been our main objective. I will therefore speak to you about our efforts to ensure that the organizations responsible for enforcing the Act, particularly police forces and border services, have the resources and training necessary for protecting Canadian communities.
it is important to be clear that Canada's current approach to cannabis, the one that's existed for decades, has simply not worked. The World Health Organization has studied cannabis use among youth in Europe and North America. In 2009-10, the WHO found that a third of young Canadians had tried cannabis by the age of 15, a higher rate than any other country in that study. And in a 2013-2014 study by the WHO, Canada remained in the top 5 for 15-year-olds and was number 1 in cannabis use among children 13 years of age or younger. As well, according to a 2016 statistical compilation by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the rate of cannabis use among Canadians 15 to 64 was almost 15%, and that was higher for that whole age span than every country except 2 others in the world. In other words, Canadians are among the heaviest and the youngest users of cannabis globally. There is clearly a need to do things differently. And that's why we've proposed this new regime based on the framework set out in Bill C45, along with enhanced measures to combat impaired driving, which are contained in Bill C46, and room for provinces and territories to tailor approaches that suit their particular circumstances. Essential to this new regime is engagement with and support for police and border officers to ensure that they have the tools that they need to enforce the law. To this end, we recently announced an investment of $274 million that includes $113.5 million over 5 years for the RCMP, the Canada Border Service Agency, and for programming within Public Safety Canada, primarily to keep organized crime out of this new legalized system and to combat smuggling. The investment also includes $161 million to train frontline officers to recognize the signs and symptoms of drug-impaired driving, to build law enforcement capacity across the country, to ensure that police have access to drug screening devices, to support research, and to enhance public awareness about the dangers of driving while impaired by drugs. Over half of this money, the $161 million that I mentioned, over half of that money will be accessible to provinces and territories over the next 5 years, and my department is already engaged with them to identify the needs and the priorities for the investments, particularly with respect to training and equipment. That collaboration across jurisdictions has been a key part of our preparations for the new legislative framework, and it will remain crucial to the implementation and ongoing evaluation of the system that Bill C45 will put in place. In that regard, as the Minister of Justice mentioned, she and I spent 2 days last week with our provincial and territorial counterparts at a meeting in Vancouver where the discussions around this particular topic were particularly important. There are 3 topics that I would like to address of the many that will need to be discussed about Bill C45, but 3 in particular that I'd like to address in a little more detail. First, on the subject of cannabis at the border. It is, of course, currently illegal to bring cannabis into Canada or to take cannabis out of Canada. Going both ways across the border, it's illegal. Under Bill C45, that would not change. Border officers already examine people and goods entering the country to prevent the smuggling of contraband, including cannabis. They make use of advanced technology, intelligence gathering, and ongoing training about how to detect and interdict substances that may not be brought across the border. And their efforts will continue, bolstered by some of the new funding that I mentioned earlier. As for the admissibility into the United States of Canadians who have previously used cannabis, we have engaged our American counterparts to ensure that they understand how our new regime will function and what it will achieve. And we have made clear that we expect travelers heading in both directions to be treated in a fair, professional, and respectful manner. At the same time, the United States is, of course, entitled to make its own admissibility decisions. I would certainly encourage Canadians to be forthright with border officials and to keep in mind that cannabis remains illegal at the federal level in the United States. In fact, some of the new funding for CBSA will go toward communications and signage to ensure that travelers are well informed about the state of the law. The situation in the United States is also complicated by the fact that there are a number of state jurisdictions that either have already legalized cannabis or are planning to do so in the immediate future. So the situation with respect to American law is evolving. Second, on the subject of organized crime. At present, Canada's non-medical cannabis industry is entirely criminal. The illegal cannabis trade in this country puts $7 billion annually, perhaps more, into the pockets of organized crime. Over half of Canadian organized crime groups are suspected or known to be involved in the cannabis market. And Canadian law enforcement spends upwards of $2 billion every year trying to enforce what is currently an ineffective legal regime. With legalization and regulation, we can enable law enforcement resources to be used more effectively, and we can dramatically reduce the involvement of and the flow of money to organized crime. In Washington state, for example, legalization a short time ago has shrunk the criminal share of the cannabis market by nearly 75%. As with tobacco, we know that the black market is unlikely to be entirely eliminated, but we're talking about taking the criminal market share from non-medical cannabis down from 100%, where it exists today, to much, much lower levels, and that would be an improvement. And thirdly, on the subject of impaired driving, Parliament will have an opportunity, obviously, to go into this in much greater detail during the study of Bill C46, the companion piece to C45. C46 is specifically aimed at better addressing the long-standing problem of driving while under the influence of alcohol or drugs. But I know it's an issue that touches many of us very directly, and I certainly feel a deep personal sense of urgency to tackle it head-on, both as Minister of Public Safety and as the Member of Parliament for Regina-Wascana. Of all the provinces, Saskatchewan has Canada's highest impaired driving rate. Among cities, Regina is third in the country, with Saskatoon not far behind. Too many families in Saskatchewan and in all of our communities mourn loved ones lost to impaired driving. This is therefore a problem that exists right now, and we would have to address it with or without the new cannabis regime, and it's urgent that we do so. As I have said, we are doing that with the legislation that we introduced in the spring, as well as with the additional cash investments that I mentioned a few moments ago. And I welcome the strong public support and advocacy that we see coming for legislation like Bill C46 from such organizations as MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They have gone so far as to engage in a very public advertising campaign about the importance of this legislation. To deal with cannabis-impaired driving specifically, our approach focuses on educating the public and facilitating detection and prosecution. In March, for example, Public Safety Canada launched a social media campaign targeting young drivers and their parents in order to raise awareness about the dangers of driving while under the influence of cannabis. And last winter, 7 police services across the country, from Halifax to Vancouver and to Yellowknife, participated in a groundbreaking pilot project to study 2 different oral fluid drug screening devices in diverse operational settings, including the dead of winter. And as you can read in the report that was released in June, police generally found the devices easy to use in various weather, temperature, and lighting conditions, and part of the investment I mentioned earlier will help ensure that police officers in communities across the country have these devices and are properly trained to use them. Finally, on this point, I know this committee has heard concerns about the timeline for implementation. But cannabis-impaired driving is happening on our streets right now. The faster we get the right tools, the funding, the training, and the legislative and regulatory authorities in place, the safer Canadians will be. Legislative delay does not make the problem go away or get better. Delay only stalls more effective action. Public health and safety have been the key drivers of our approach to cannabis and will remain our overarching preoccupations. For too long, Canadians, and especially Canadian youth, have been using cannabis at world record rates to the great profit of criminals and organized crime. That needs to change, and that's why we have this bill before you now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you. And I will now go to questions, and I think we'll have some good questions. We had over 100 witnesses in the last week, and they brought many, many different perspectives and opinions, and I'm sure they'll generate lots of questions. So we'll start our 7-minute round of questions with Mr. Oliver.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, ministers, for being here tonight and and answering our questions and making your statements. So as the chair has mentioned, we had 5 marathon days last week. We heard from over 100 witnesses. One night I think we even went to around 8 o'clock to make sure we fit everybody in. And what the benefit of that process was, we really got to hear themes because it's such a condensed testimony. We could hear the themes. So my questions are really just going to be coming out of some of the themes. I won't be able to touch on all of them. The first one, Minister Pettipat-Taylor, was the very significant focus on the need for public education now, to get out ahead of the legalization. We heard that many youth really don't think there is a concern, that cannabis doesn't pose a threat to them. There's a lot of misinformation. So I know you have the $9.6 million fund. Congratulations on that. You're getting it launched, but could you maybe say a bit more about how that health education piece will roll out? When would I experience it in my riding of Oakville?
Thank you so much for the question. I guess first and foremost, I have to start off by saying that our government is committed to protecting the health and safety of children. And the $9.6 million investment that we've invested is an initial investment as well. We have to make that very clear. We recognize that we have learned through the task force and through different groups that we've consulted with that it's really, really important to make sure that the prevention and awareness is done before the actual legislation is passed, before that we roll this out. So as a result of that, the work in the public awareness and prevention has already started. I believe that last week you guys had heard from several groups that we've even partnered with. And one particular group, Jeunesse Sans Drogue, I believe they were here and showed you, the type of work, the tools that they've developed. These are the types of things that we're really pleased to see that have happened, and that we've seen that the feedback has been very good, and this document, this tool has been well received by doctors, practitioners, parents, and the list goes on. The other thing as well, I think, though, that we have to recognize is that we also have to make sure that the public awareness campaigns get out to the youth, the people whom we're really targeting. And we recognize that perhaps in our generation, watching perhaps a hockey game on a Saturday night, we would invest in commercials. Well, probably that's not the best way to invest our money right now in targeting our youth. So we recognize that we were really going to have to focus on a social media campaign, and that's really what we're doing, investing on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and whatever the case may be to make sure that we can get the messages to the kids. And finally, we want to continue to collaborate with provinces and territories to make sure that the public education campaign also can be done collaboratively and that we have access to all of the same information.
A second theme we heard Minister Wilson-Raybould was about the severity of the criminal penalties for those that are acting outside of the legalized or the legal permissions, I guess, that are in the Act. The example that really hit home for me was the height restrictions on home plants. So we heard from the task force that the 1 meter height restriction was not about preventing youth from accessing drugs or black market. It was simply the average fence of height bylaw was 4 feet, and they were concerned about neighbors and sympathetic to neighbors next to somebody growing their 4 plants. But in the Act, the penalties for over a meter, I think 1 meter to 1.5 meters, it's a ticketable offense, and anything over 1.5 meters is then criminal charges with penalties of up to 14 years. So that's the example of that hit home to me of could you maybe explain the 14 years and the severity of the penalties, and then maybe is there any room for softening on some of those that aren't really technically criminal charges? They're more municipal bylaw issues. So.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for hearing from the over 100 witnesses. In terms of the penalties from ticketing to 14 years, there is a broad spectrum of penalties, and the imposition of a ticketable offense up to 14 years will depend on the individual circumstances of the particular infraction or offense. And if we're specifically talking about the height of plants that can be produced or cultivated at home, I recognize what the task force has indicated in terms of the height of plants. from my understanding, plants can grow quite high, and the higher the plant, the more product the plant can provide, which is an indication that there might be an intention to divert some of that product to the illegal market. So it entirely depends on the circumstances in which an officer finds the plants in that circumstance, or any of the other offenses, whether or not it would be appropriate for a ticketable offense, depending on the possession amounts or the circumstances of another offense, if it would be up to 14 years. And there's obviously discretion that a judge would have in imposing a sentence. Likewise, there's discretion that a prosecutor would have, whether proceeding by way of summary conviction or indictment.
Great, thank you. And we heard from Mr. Goodell, we heard from an RCMP officer, I believe, who said that I think it would be naive to think that this act would make a difference in organized crime. You mentioned, I guess, could you tell us a bit more about the regulated market and how you perceive it cutting into the profits or deterring organized crime? Could you reflect on that for the committee?
Well, the objective, obviously, is to stop the flow of illegal cash to organized crime to the maximum extent possible. It's a $7 billion market, probably more, right now. The market is 100% controlled by organized crime at the moment. We can obviously do better than that. Can you totally eliminate it 100%? While that's the goal, it might be naive to think you could get rid of all of it. But I think we can put a substantial dent in it. And the experience in other jurisdictions, as in the state of Washington, would indicate that when you blunt the profit motive, when you have a strictly regulated regime, properly structured, and you take the profit motive out of it or substantially reduce it by changing the legal structure, you can reduce that flow of profit. And by the estimates in the state of Washington, they have accomplished a reduction of about 75% over the course of the last relatively short span of time. Our objective would be to do better than that, but the numbers from other jurisdictions would suggest that we can certainly anticipate considerable progress that would be much better than the state of affairs that exists today.
Time's up.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of the ministers for joining us tonight, and I especially want to congratulate the new Health Minister on her role. I'm looking forward to working with you to get good outcomes for Canadians. I'm going to start my questions with the Justice Minister. Everything that you've said, all of you actually, sounds very nice, but the reality of what's happening is a bit different. I mean, we had the Liberal members of this committee shut down our request, both NDP colleague and myself, to hear from young people, and maybe from Uruguay, the only other country that's legalized marijuana. And we heard testimony from the police that it will be impossible for them to be ready for the July 1st implementation date. Provinces, many of them have not come with a plan, and certainly not with legislation. And we heard from municipalities that they're not going to be ready for that implementation date. The Indigenous people said they're not going to be ready. And so if we consider that 88% of Canadians don't consume cannabis, and we have 283 days remaining until this arbitrary date, why are you in such a hurry to risk public harm? We haven't got testing in place with the police and training for impaired drug driving. The public awareness campaign that has been mentioned, we had 100,000 parents trained, and that's it. That's the only testimony received. So are you willing to consider pushing off the date until all of these stakeholders are ready?
Well, thank you for the question, and I mean, perhaps I can summarize some of the comments that we made in our opening remarks, and to quote my learned colleague, the current reality of the status quo in this country, as Minister Goodell has said, has been an abysmal failure. We have the highest rates of cannabis use among young people in the country, and we are committed to ensuring that we do something about that as quickly and as appropriately and as efficiently as we can. We are committed to moving forward with legalization in July of 2018. And in doing so, we have taken an extremely comprehensive approach over the last 2 years to ensure that we introduce and continue to have conversations with all of our counterparts in the provinces and territories. Those conversations continued last week and will continue as we move forward towards July 2018. We engaged a substantive group of experts in terms of the task force report who, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, conducted extensive consultations across the country.
That's fine,
which
thank
we
you.
benefited from that.
I see you're going to stick to the date. And of course, we're presuming that people are smoking it now, whether it's legal or not. So we're assuming that legalization is the only solution to address the issue, which I'm not sure it is. My second question is for the health minister. We heard testimony that there's an increase of 30% in schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, depression, anxiety, and addiction in people who consume cannabis under the age of 25. We also heard discussion about home grow and the yields, as we talked about with the plants, could be up to 600 grams of cannabis in a dwelling with no requirements for potency quality control, no requirements for storage lockup, nothing to prevent parents from smoking up in front of their children. And we know from Washington's experience that home grow is where organized crime gets a foothold, and so they don't allow it, and the Canadian Police agreed. So why do you think it's in the best interests of young people's health to allow home grow?
Well, first of all, again, to echo what my colleagues have indicated, the evidence is clear that prohibition, the status quo, is just not working. So we truly have to make sure that we follow our plan. The objective of C45 is to legalize, strictly regulate, and to restrict access to cannabis to youth. That's really our priority in all this. And again, as you've indicated, we know that there's a high rate of usage when it comes to young Canadians. I just have a few quick numbers here. 21% of youth between the ages of 15 and 19 years of age consume cannabis. 30% of young Canadians between the ages of 20 and 24 years old consume cannabis. So we recognize that we have to have a regulated system in place because they're having access to unregulated products at this point, and we want to ensure that the products that they are going to consume, if they choose to consume, are going to be regulated. And once again, we are not encouraging youth to consume cannabis, but we want to make sure that it's safe and that we get it out of the hands of children.
Thank you. It's in their house. They're going to have a chance to get hold of it. Question for the Minister of Public Safety. I'm going to follow up on a question that Mr. Mulcair asked in the House today. He was also talking about the border issue where when people try to cross the border and they're asked if they've smoked cannabis, that other than the Prime Minister, everybody else would not be allowed entrance into the U.S. You've said that that's the case and the U.S. has the ability to say, what's going to be legal in their country. Knowing that there's going to be a big problem, do you think there's a need to do some public awareness with youth that might want to work in the future in global roles? And with 283 days left, when is that going to happen?
There's a requirement and a very valid, important public policy objective to be served by making sure that all people understand what the legal or procedural consequences of their choices and their decisions are. As I mentioned in my remarks, one of the things that CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency, will be trying to do is to make sure that people are well aware of the border implications of their behavior. We would not tolerate the Americans telling us what to do about our border. And similarly, we will leave the decision-making about American procedures to the Americans. That's their jurisdiction and their responsibility. What we can do is to make sure that Canadians are aware of the legal implications and the consequences. And we also will carry on a continuing dialogue with the United States to ensure that the treatment of Canadians at the border is fair and respectful and professional, as we would have the right to expect as we approach their border, as they have the right to expect that kind of treatment when they approach our border. And I think it is important to note that the legal situation in the United States is complicated and evolving because state jurisdictions are going, in many cases, in exactly the opposite direction that the federal jurisdiction in the United States has chosen to adopt. So it will be a situation in the U.S. where I think you can expect an evolving legal environment, and one where we need to make sure, as much as possible, the Canadians are aware of what that environment is.
Thank you.
Mr. Davies.
Chair, and thank you to the ministers for being with us today. And again, I'd like to offer my congratulations to the Minister of Health on your appointment, and I look forward to working with you as well. My first question will be to the Minister of Health. The Task Force on Cannabis Legalization recommended that your government legalize and regulate edibles and concentrates. Here's what the Honourable Anne McClellan said last week when I asked her why the task force made that recommendation. Quote, "It's a growth area in the cannabis marketplace. Obviously, if you're concerned about public health, you want to move people away from smoking. If it's for medicinal purposes, there are therapies in non-smoking forms. As mentioned in the task force report, the edible market is growing. If you want to move from the illicit market into a regulated legal market, then you have to offer the quality and choice that the illicit market can provide. I think it's fair to say that we heard over and over again from a wide variety of people we talked to. There are public health reasons and public safety reasons why you would want to authorize or allow edibles in various forms," end quote. Minister, given that two of the most important purposes of this bill are to reduce illicit activities and provide access to quality controlled supply of cannabis, those are right in Section 7, why did your government ignore this recommendation? In other words, if prohibition doesn't work, as you said, why are you prohibiting edibles?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Mr. Davies. I guess, first of all, what I'd like to say is that our government has committed that by July of 2018, that we will ensure that Canadians have access to dry cannabis, fresh cannabis, and oils. From there, that is the beginning of the work that needs to be done. From there, however, we agree with the task force recommendations, but we'll have to bring in regulations to address the issue of edibles, and that is going to be done in due course. We recognize that with the experience in the States, they have extensive experience with respect to this, and most of their issues and complications really came out because of the issue of edibles. They weren't properly prepared to deal with it. So we want to really ensure that we have the proper regulatory framework that's in place to make sure that we have all the necessary tools that are in place to make sure that we get this right. When I look at edibles, we can see that there's a wide range of products that could be legalized. But if there's hundreds, if not thousands, of products that can be made legal, we have to make sure that we have the right regulatory process to get this done right. And that is why we're moving with this process.
Thank you. Well, we did have Sam Kamen, who is a professor at the University of Denver, who told the committee that, quote, "I think our experience in the American experience is certainly that we have learned how to mitigate those risks." And he pointed to resealable packaging, non-transparent packaging, clear portion size, maximum THC per package, markings on the individual pieces, no marketing to children, etc., are all part of the state-of-the-art Colorado experience. And Minister, I'll just put you once again, leaving these products wholly unregulated means the risks of edibles and concentrates remains wholly unmitigated. Why is that better? Why are you content to leave those products to the black market and, as the Minister of Public Safety said, to organized crime, who probably are not selling their products in child-proof packages? Why are you content to leave that for another year or so instead of regulating them now, as Colorado has done very successfully?
Well, first and foremost, we want to make sure that we get this right. And as indicated, we are committed to bringing in the regulation that is needed regarding edibles. That is our commitment. However, we want to make sure that we use best practices. And again, we continue to consult with our neighbors down south. And they have told us loud and clear that if they had a choice, they would probably follow Canada's lead right now as opposed to how they did it.
Thank you. Mr. Goodale, to you about the border. Now, we know, I think we're all parliamentarians, we know that the United States is a sovereign country, and certainly nobody is asking anybody to tell the Americans what to do. The reality is that come July 1, 2018, if in fact that's the target date set, that there will be a new legal reality in this country. And we all know that there are stories of Canadians going to the U.S. border where U.S. border guards ask if someone has consumed cannabis. And if the answer is yes, they are routinely denied entry. So the question to you, sir, is, are you working to try to reach an agreement with the Americans that recognizes the new legal reality? Or will business people and ordinary Canadians simply have to try their luck when they get to the U.S. border on July 2nd?
We're constantly raising with the Americans the reality of the changing legal regime in Canada, one that we believe, on the basis of very compelling argument, will be more effective than the American regime, the American federal regime, in keeping cannabis out of the hands of kids and stopping the flow of illegal money to organized crime. That's an ongoing dialogue, and it's one that we will raise at every opportunity to ensure that Canadians are treated fairly.
Thank you. To the Justice Minister, C45 retains a criminalized approach to cannabis in many respects, including possession limits, cultivation restrictions, and selling offences. Now, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police told this committee that, and I quote, "We know that there was in 2016 16 or 17,000 charges for simple possession of marijuana." There were actually more than that. But those will be replaced with ticketing. They'll be replaced with nuisance calls. They'll be replaced if, unfortunately, we go forward with personal grows, us having to manage those grow operations, which, of course, will be very time-consuming, and an onerous process for our officers who will then have to seize the plants, take them back to a police department or facility to store them. This is not to mention the new enforcement provisions around cannabis-impaired driving. We don't see this in any sort of time saving for our staff. Now, one of the purposes of the Act in Section 7 is to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system. So given that law enforcement agencies believe that the proposed framework will not reduce enforcement activities, and given that your government recently announced plans to spend an additional $274 million on cannabis enforcement, how exactly will Bill C45 reduce the burden on the criminal justice system?
Well, thanks for the question. And I mean, in Section 7 of the Act, yes, we're looking to, one of the purposes to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system. We, in the Cannabis Act, have introduced a series of penalties that run the gamut or the spectrum in terms of from ticketing up to serious indictable offenses. And I recognize what you're saying the police officers have said. We are committed in terms of bringing in the Cannabis Act to ensure, one, as Minister Goodale spoke about, that we provide law enforcement officers with all of the necessary tools that they will require, from drug-impaired driving to other measures, to ensure that they can do their jobs appropriately. We're going to continue to work with our counterparts in the provinces and territories to provide them with the support that they need, as well as continue to work with municipal governments. I think that the spectrum from ticketing up to the realities of the more serious offenses that might result will contribute to a reduction in the use of court times, particularly where this involves younger people, where this involves the less serious charges between 30 and 50 grams of cannabis possession. There are alternatives than going through the regular criminal justice system.
Doesn't sound that it'll reduce the burden.
Time's up, Mr. Davies.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We go to Dr. Elson.
Thank you, ministers, all for coming. Now, Minister Goodale, I take to heart particularly what you say about how we need to address the criminal gang problem. I practiced emergency medicine in Winnipeg for almost 20 years and was intimately familiar as to why we were the murder capital of Canada. I quite frankly lost count of the number of bullet wounds and stab wounds I treated, the vast majority of those due to the illegal drug trade, and most of that being cannabis. So I thank you, and I appreciate the statistics that you were able to quote from Washington and Colorado about the market share that has gone down from the illegal market due to the legalization. Now, another big public safety issue, again, that I became intimately familiar with, was impaired driving in all of its forms. We know that, as you said, that this is something that's going on. This, legalization isn't going to create this. We know it's happening. Do we have any data right now as to the prevalence of people who today are driving impaired on cannabis? And I don't mean accident victims who simply the presence was found, but simply data on collisions and prevalence due to impaired driving due to cannabis?
I don't have those statistics right with me this evening, but if I could, this might be of interest to all members of the committee. I will ask my officials to prepare a summary of statistically what we do know at the present time of drug impaired versus alcohol impaired, and I would send that back to the committee just as soon as we're able to compile that arithmetic.
Okay, certainly. Thank you. Now, in Colorado, we heard testimony that what they thought was an apparent spike in cannabis-impaired driving was actually due to improved detection methods, as opposed to an increased actual incidence. Will this legislation and its provisions that are coming out of it in law enforcement, will they help to better detect and track impaired driving due to cannabis?
They will for two. The legislation, particularly Bill C46, which is the companion piece, the legislation will assist in that regard in two ways. First of all, it will introduce new roadside screening equipment that will be more helpful in providing preliminary information about potential drug impairment, and then lead to more